Welcome to the tutorial exposure. So in this tutorial you may see some things that you've seen in previous tutorials, but this time I'd like you to take them in context of creating timing for your scene. So let's begin by going to the X-Sheet view. I'm going to maximize this again. And going down to the right-hand corner where we see the word overwrite. So by default, this is always set to overwrite, and when you click on it, it's changed to insert. So you can toggle back and forth between those two. What this is the filling mode, so the way that cells are filled in the column view. If we go back to overwrite, and I double-click in frame 9, and I change drawing 5 to 1, and hit enter, you'll see that it's just overwritten 5 for 1. However, if I then change overwrite to insert, and I change drawing 11 to 1, you'll notice that 11 has been bumped down, as has 12, 13, and 14. So the range used to be from 16 to 19, and now it's from 17 to 20. So that's the difference between overwrite and insert. So it all depends on the way you'd like to fill in values or drawing numbers. So if you do want to enter in a value, you just saw that you can double click in it to enter that value, and you can press enter to go to the next cell. If you'd like to escape out of this mode, you simply need to press the escape button. So in animation, holding an exposure is quite a common practice. The most common type of frame hold is a double frame hold, when a frame is held for 2 exposures. So to do this, you can select an empty cell somewhere in a column, then go to the top menu and select Animation, Cell, Hold Exposure, and you can choose from 1, 2, 3, 4, or an infinite number of cell holds. By default, the cell is always held for 1 frame. So let's go to the hold option, and in the hold value dialog box you can type the number that you desire. So let's pick something like 5 and say OK. Now when I decide to type in a drawing number here, so let's type in 1, and I press enter, it's automatically held for 5 frames, and it jumps to the 6th frame for me to enter in another drawing, like that. So you can't do it on a frame that already exists. It won't extend an exposure. That's what extending an exposure is. This is called holding an exposure. It's done as a default setting. So I'm going to go back and change it to 1. So you can actually extend exposures, as I was saying, that already exist in your X-Sheet by using this red arrow here at the side. A double arrow cursor appears, and then you can drag your selection box, and when you release, your exposure has been held for the number of frames that you drag down to. You can also do this with a multiple selection. So if I want to drag 2 to 5 for another 4 frames, what you can do is bring that double-headed cursor back up, hold Shift, make your multiple selection, then release the Shift key, and then release your mouse. And so now 2, 3, 4, and 5 have been repeated, so 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this can only be done if your drawings have numerical values. If you named your drawings with actual letters and not just numbers, then this type of system doesn't work. It really only works with numerical values. You should also know that you can find this option at the top menu if you go to Animation, Cells, Extend Exposure, or use the keyboard shortcut F5, so you don't necessarily need to use the dragging method with the red arrow. So let's go back to the timeline for a minute, and let's look at how to drag cells. So in the timeline, cells are not restricted to staying in the layer or the row that they were created in. You can actually select a cell and then drag it up to a different layer, given that it's also a drawing layer. So for example, you could not drag this down to a peg layer, for example, or a group. You can also select a range of cells and do the same thing. Or you can also select a range or a single cell, and if you start dragging and then hold down Alt and Command as you bring it into the new position, you'll notice that a green circle with a white plus appears beside your cursor, and this is letting you know that you're not just displacing these cells, but you're actually copying them. So if I then release my mouse, you'll see that the cells have actually been copied as well. In Windows, you would start to drag the cell or the frame range and then hold down the Control button to copy. You can also hold down the Shift key as you're dragging, and what this does is it actually inserts the frame range or the single cell between other cells that already exist. So by default, you're always overwriting, but if you hold down Shift while you start to drag, then you'll insert between cells. You can also do the same thing in the X-sheet view. You can select a cell, and you have to grab it by these dots here that you can see on the side of the cell, and then you can drag it to another place. For example, like that. You can also do the same thing with a range. You can shift and select a range and then grab these gray dots to drag the entire range elsewhere. Once again, if you select a single cell or a range of cells, and then as you start to drag them, you hold down Alt and Command, you can then copy that range of cells. And as you can see, there's an _1 because it acknowledges it's a copy. And you can also insert a group instead of overwriting them by holding down Shift as you drag them. And then you've inserted the row. So there are several ways that you can increase and decrease exposures. So you can select a cell and you can go to the top menu and select Animation, Cell, Increase Exposure. Or you can use the keyboard shortcut plus, or you can right click on the cell and select Exposure, Increase Exposure, or you can use the button that's located in both the timeline and the X-sheet view toolbar to increase exposure. So there are obviously several ways you can do that, and you can also do the reverse. You can have a cell selected and then decrease the exposure by going to Animation, Cell, Decrease Exposure. You can also use the keyboard shortcut minus. You can right click on the cell and select Exposure, Decrease Exposure, or you can use the button at the top here, the Decrease Exposure button, to decrease the final exposure. You can also use the field at the bottom where it says exposure to increase or decrease in increments, and once again you can also type in a value to make large exposure increases. So to get rid of a large exposure extension like this, you can use the clear and pull feature, and you can do this in several ways as well. You can select the entire exposure range, then go to the top menu and select Animation, Cell, Clear and Pull. So not only did it clear drawing 8 and all of its exposures from frame 21, but it also brought all the subsequent drawings after drawing 8 up the column sheet. You can try the same thing by right-clicking on the cell and selecting Exposure, Clear and Pull. So it did exactly the same thing. Or you can use the keyboard shortcut Z. Or you can use the button at the top in the timeline view toolbar or the exposure sheet toolbar, the clear, exposure, and pull button, like that. So when you delete an exposure, you're not actually deleting the drawing like we mentioned before. You can always bring it back. There are also several ways that you can delete exposures. You can right-click on a cell and select Delete, or you could simply hit the Delete key. So to entirely clear the exposure from a drawing, you'd have to go to the top menu and select Animation, Cell, Clear Exposure. You can also do that for an entire frame range. So you could shift click to select your range and then right click and select Clear. There's also a button that exists in the timeline view. if you right-click on the Timeline View toolbar and select Customize. It's the Clear Exposure button, so it does the same thing. So there are also several ways of inserting a blank cell, and even if you are in the overwrite mode, it works as if you are in the insertion mode. So if you select, let's say, cell drawing number 14, you can always go to the top menu and select Animation, Cell, Insert Blank Cell. Or you can use the keyboard shortcut X. Or you could right-click and select Exposure, Insert Blank Cell. Or you can add a button to the X-Sheet toolbar by right-clicking on it and selecting Customize. And then by selecting the Insert Blank button and adding it to the toolbar. So that once again adds another blank cell to the column. So you can set the exposure for a specific range, and you can do this by shift-clicking that range, and then by going to the top menu and selecting Animation, Cell, Set Exposure to, and once again you can select 1, 2, 3, or Set Exposure just to bring up a dialog box. You can select a larger increment. So let's say 5 and say OK, and now each drawing in that range has been held for 5 exposures. There's also a button that exists for this feature in the extra buttons of the Timeline and X-Sheet toolbar, and you can get it the same way you've gotten all the others by right-clicking and selecting Customize. So you can fill a selection with a single exposure, and this selection can be between two columns, let's say from here to here. It can be a range between two columns, like that. It can be all of one column, it could be a single cell, whatever you like. So let's select a range like this. And then by going to the top and going to the animation menu, you can select Cell Fill Selection. And it gives you a dialog box where you can put in a value. So if you wanted to fill this entire area, so these two columns from frame 23 to 29 with drawing 5, then you can enter in 5 and say Apply. And now both of those columns at the said frames have been filled with drawing 5. You can also fill a selection with a sequence, and this sequence can be forward, backwards, it can be single, double, it can be a cycle, etc. So it can be many things. And you can, this once again, the selection can be over one cell, a cell range in one column, or cell range in many columns. So first you have to select the range. So let's keep the range that we already have selected. Then you have to go back to the animation menu and select Cell, Sequence Fill. So you get the Sequence Fill dialog box, which asks you your starting value. So let's say drawing 1, the increments. So right now it's set to 1, but let's say 2, which means it'll go from 1, 3, 5, 7. If I left it at 1, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Your hold, so if I want to hold them for 2 frames, 1 frame, whatever you'd like. So let's hold it just for 1 frame. If you'd like to cycle it, and if so, how many cycles. And then if you realize that your selection is greater than the frame number at which you need the sequence fill to go to, then you can actually select a specific frame number that you would like the fill to stop at. The padding is the number of digits that you would like your drawing number to be represented by. So if you'd like your drawing number to be 00, 1, for example, then 002, 003, you would have to put 3 pound signs in here to represent the number of digits you would like to appear. You could also enter in the name of the drawing that you would like, and it would be followed by a dash and the number. And I'll actually also put a frame hold on so you can see what that looks like as well. So let's hit Apply. And then as you can see here, our sequence starts at 1, just as it's supposed to. It goes in increments of 2, so it goes 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc. Each frame is held for 2 frames. So this is held for 2 frames, 2 frames, 2 frames, and that there are 3 digits in the name of the drawing. So because there are 3 pound signs here. So you get the idea of how that works. There is also a button available for this sequence fill. So you would once again go up to the X sheet or timeline view toolbar, right click on it, select customize, and what we just did was the sequence fill. The previous feature I showed you was the fill selection, so you also have the button for that. And what I'm about to show you is fill cells randomly. So as you can see, all the buttons that you need for everything I'm showing you is available in the toolbar manager. So the reason that you may want to fill a column randomly, and the camera peg path is actually a good example, is to give a shaky effect. So with the camera peg specifically, if you randomly fill the X, Y, and Z path with random values, then the camera will move from side to side, up and down, and forward and backwards in a very random way, giving the illusion of the ground shaking or an earthquake. So let's select Arrange in our column. And then let's go up to the animation menu again and select cells, fill cells randomly. So once again we get a dialog box where we're able to choose our minimum value and our maximum value. So let's just choose 1, and let's say our maximum value is 10. You can choose if you want frame hold, so there could be like a random jumping, then a shaking if the hold is quite long. So depending on the effect that you desire, you can make that choice for yourself. And then if you're not using the camera peg path, you might want whole numbers, because if you're doing this for a drawing column rather than a function column, you can only really use whole numbers. There are no such thing as decimal increments for a drawing name. So I'm going to uncheck that because we are using a camera path, and say apply and then close. So the last thing I wanted to show you was how to create cycles. And you've seen this before, but let's do it again one more time. Let's select a frame range. So let's select, say 1 to 8 here. Then let's go to the top menu and select Edit Copy, Cells from X Sheet. And let's choose a place, so let's put it here maybe. And then go to Edit, Paste Cycle. So then the Paste Cycle dialog box comes up, and you can choose the number of cycles, so let's say 3 for example. And then you can choose if you want it to go forward, so which would mean that our selection I believe was from 1 to 8, so it would be 1 to 8, 1 to 8, 1 to 8. If you do reverse, it would be 8 to 1, 8 to 1, 8 to 1. If you do forward reverse, it would be 1 to 8, 8 to 1, 1 to 8. And I'm saying this because there are 3, so it'll just flip-flop back and forth depending on the number of cycles that you've chosen. And reverse forward, of course, would be 8 to 1, 1 to 8, 8 to 1. So let's choose maybe forward reverse just to see what that looks like, and say OK. And you can see it's here, so it goes 1 to 8, and then 8 because it's technically there for 2 frames, it looks like a frame hold. So 8 to 1, and then 1 is here and 1 is here, so it looks like a frame hold here as well, or an extended exposure here. So then 1 to 8 again. So you can see it's cycled 3 times in the forward reverse order that we asked it to. You can also do this through the Paste Special dialog box as well, and I'll show you how to do that. So let's select the same increment, go back up to Edit, Copy Cells from X Sheet, and then we can select another space. We're sort of running out of space here, and then select Edit, Paste Special. So in the Paste Special dialog box, here's the cycle window, and you have, it looks identical to the window I just showed you for the cycling. So I'm going to undo that. And one thing you have to remember when you're pasting cycles is that they are in fact still linked, and that they aren't copies. So here 1 to 8, and then this one 8 to 1, these are all the same drawing. So if I change number 1 here, it's going to change the 1 here, the 1 here, the 1 down here. They're still linked together. They aren't copies of the original range that we selected. You can also do things like paste in reverse. So if we select the same range, go to Edit, copy cells from X sheet and then come back over here, you can select Edit, Paste and Reverse. So it'll go from 8 to 1, so without you having to go through the whole cycle dialog box. And there's also a button that exists for this in the Toolbars Manager, and it looks sort of like a loop, I believe. Well, here it is, create cycles. There's a few that seem to only exist for the timeline and not necessarily for the X sheet. So if you can't find a specific button in the X sheet, I would check the timeline view toolbar manager and see if you can find it there. So it'd be this one right here, create cycle. So you can always add that one if you want. It's a useful one to have. Actually, the last subject that I'd like to talk to you about is navigating between frames and columns. So if you select a frame somewhere in the timeline view, you can use the keyboard shortcuts H and J to scroll up and then down between the different layers. Like that. You can also use the drawing menu and select drawing, previous layer, or drawing, next layer. To scroll between drawings, let's use this row, you can use the keyboard shortcuts F and G. And you'll notice that you're not scrolling between every frame necessarily, but every drawing. So this one drawing is held for 2 exposures, so you jump from this thick line to the other side of this thick line using the keyboard shortcuts F and G. You can also use the drawing menu for this by going to drawing, next drawing, or drawing, previous drawing. So to actually jump between frames, so these individual little frames, you would have to use the keyboard shortcuts comma and period. So here you're actually scrolling through the individual exposures of the same drawing. And once again, you can also select those from the top menu by going to play, previous frame, or play, next frame. So that's it for the tutorial exposures. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, managing drawings.